Everyone, today I will be breaking down a paper by Grueschow and colleagues titled Automatic versus Choice-Dependent Value Representations in the Human Brain. Alright, so let's start what we already knew before this study. When we make decisions, like deciding whether to buy something, our brain uses this idea of subjective value. Basically, it's how we weigh the pros and cons of different options. There's a group of brain regions, like the medial prefrontal cortex, the posterior cingulate cortex, and the ventral striatum, that are all a part of what's called the valuation system. This system lights up when we are thinking about value-based decisions, like should I buy this movie for $10? Most of the research before focused on how these brain areas process values directly tied to a choice, what's called choice-relevant value. For example, studies showed that when you're making a decision, the MPFC becomes more active. But here's the catch. Values that aren't directly related to a decision, like the price of something you're not even considering, can still affect you. And these are called task-irrelevant values, and they are not related to the decision at hand. For instance, when you're making a decision on the movie, the flashy price of something else nearby, like a $50 popcorn maker, could still catch your attention. These task-irrelevant values don't directly factor into a decision you're making, but they can still influence behavior by grabbing your focus. These values can slow down our decisions, but we don't really know how the brain functionally represents task-irrelevant values. That's where the gaps come in. There were three main things we didn't know. We don't fully understand how the brain represents task-irrelevant values that are not directly tied to a current decision. Second, do the same brain areas process both relevant and irrelevant values, or is this processing happening in separate regions? Finally, no one has really explored how task-irrelevant values can affect behavior, and why they can slow down unrelated tasks by capturing our attention. This is what's known as value attentional capture, and it's essentially when our attention gets pulled towards something because it holds some value to us, even if it's unrelated to what we're doing. And so finally, the research question they investigated in this study is, are automatic value representations functionally distinct from choice-relevant value representations, and how do these signals affect our behavior?
So what specific task and analysis methods were used? This study consisted of a sample of 26 participants. Prior to the fMRI task, participants were given 20 Swiss francs and rated their willingness to pay for each of 672 DVDs presented at an auction using a scale of 0 to 20 Swiss francs. The purpose of this rating session was to establish an honest, subjective value for each movie. Next, participants took part in an fMRI task where they alternated between two decision-making contexts: purchasing decisions where subjective value was relevant, and perceptual decisions where it was irrelevant. Both tasks used the same visual and auditory stimuli to control for sensory and motor factors. During the purchasing decisions, participants were presented with a price for a DVD and decided whether they were willing to pay that amount for the movie based on its subjective value. During perceptual decisions, participants judged whether a number they were presented with matched the number of faces on the DVD cover, a task unrelated to subjective value. Following the experiment, the researchers analyzed participants' choices using logistic regressions to confirm that participants followed instructions properly. Additionally, they examined whether irrelevant subjective values captured attention during perceptual tasks by analyzing response times. Participants completed 10 of these fMRI sessions involving 30 purchasing and 30 perceptual choices each. Researchers used 5 general linear models to compare bold signals related to choice-relevant and choice-irrelevant subjective values, assess choice consistency, and examine value-driven attentional capture. Control analyses evaluated whether other factors influenced bold signals during purchasing decisions beyond subjective value.
So what did the study find? First, the researchers analyzed participant behavior during the decision-making tasks. They started by analyzing the relationship between reaction time and condition. Reaction time did not significantly differ between the two conditions, but did differ between participants. This means that the processing time and demand was about the same for both conditions. In the perceptual condition, reaction times increased with the number of faces participants were shown on the DVD cover. Reaction times also reflected value-driven attentional capture. This means that when choice-irrelevant subjective values increased, participants took longer to make decisions even when they were in the perceptual decision condition. Purchasing decisions were also affected by subjective values. In the perceptual decision condition, subjective values were irrelevant. subjective value was choice relevant for purchasing decisions. There was a relationship between what the participants said they were willing to pay 1 to 3 days earlier and their later decision to purchase the DVD. The researchers looked at a few brain regions using fMRI that are known to be involved in value representation. They observed which regions were active during automatic and choice-dependent value processing. The medial prefrontal cortex showed activation when choice depended on subjective valuation. This region was most active during purchasing decisions. Medial prefrontal cortex activity was also predictive of purchasing decisions, meaning that it plays a role in evaluating possible choices. The ventral striatum was also more active during purchasing decisions than perceptual. Activation in both the MPFC and VS is associated with subjective valuation, but only when subjective valuation is choice relevant. The posterior cingulate cortex was active during both perceptual and purchasing tasks, representing subjective values both when relevant and irrelevant to the task. PCC was involved in attentional capture, allowing for task-irrelevant subjective valuation to unconsciously impact behavior. This region is involved in automatic and choice-independent processing of subjective values. Overall, regions associated with subjective valuation were more active during purchasing choices. Separate regions in the dorsal attentional network and lateral occipital complex were more active during perceptual choices. This demonstrates that distinct brain regions are functionally specialized for value processing and perceptual processing.
Like most studies, there are some limitations to this research. The main limitation in this study relates to some discrepancy in findings across other studies that depended on the paradigm or imaging techniques used. LeBreton et al. In 2009 described that the ventromedial prefrontal cortex was involved in a valuation system that shows automatic, choice-irrelevant subjective value coding. The technique that they used was they pooled activity across several regions, including the medial prefrontal cortex, the ventral striatum, and the posterior cingulate cortex. On the contrary, Plasma et al. In 2007 found that the ventromedial prefrontal cortex was more strongly correlated with subjective value in relevant rather than irrelevant value-based choices, and they did whole brain voxel-wise analysis. In terms of next steps, this research may require further studies to investigate the discrepancy in the findings. But what does all this really mean in the context of the real world? Research has indicated that the medial prefrontal cortex is involved in reward processing, impulsivity, and drug-seeking behaviors, which are all seen in addiction. Revealing underlying functions of the medial prefrontal cortex in decision-making could promote a better understanding of addiction in research. Another application of this research is towards ADHD, also known as attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. ADHD has been associated with impaired decision-making in tasks involving significant cognitive control. So understanding value-based decisions and the inner workings of the MPFC and the PCC could help with understanding the neural mechanisms behind ADHD. A final research application is towards autism. Individuals with autism show attentional differences, with some evidence pointing to under-responsivity in orienting to salient environmental events. Research also may show reduced distractibility for information that has personal motivational salience. Understanding the neural correlates of attentional capture in autism could promote better research outcomes. To answer the primary research question, there are two distinct value coding mechanisms in the brain involving the MPFC and the PCC, and this creates a functional dissociation between regions in the brain's valuation circuitry.